The wind that January afternoon cut through Evelyn's coat like broken glass. She watched Clayton Mercer's broad back disappear through the crowd, his boots striking the frozen mud with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequence. Around her, the people of Dry Hollow stared with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, but mostly just hunger for gossip they could chew on through the long winter nights ahead. Her hands shook, not from the cold, though Wyoming in 1887 possessed a cruelty Philadelphia winters had never prepared her for, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that she'd gambled everything on a man who'd lied in every letter he'd written. "Miss?" A porter touched her elbow. "The train leaves in 15 minutes. You still got your return ticket?" Evelyn opened her mouth. Nothing came out but a wheeze, barely audible above the wind. The porter's expression shifted from polite concern to uncomfortable recognition. He'd already heard then. Word traveled fast in small towns. "Right," he muttered. "Well, good luck, I suppose." He left her standing there beside her trunk, a battered leather thing that had belonged to her mother, filled with clothes meant for a wedding that would never happen and a life that had just dissolved like smoke. Inside that trunk, 3 dresses, undergarments, a Bible she hadn't opened since her sister's funeral, sheet music she could no longer sing, and at the bottom, wrapped in her grandmother's shawl, the last photograph of her family before fever took them all. $23 in her pocket. The return ticket Clayton had promised never existed. He'd told her he'd take care of everything once she arrived. That's what his letters had said. Come west. Marry me. Build something new. Lies, as it turned out, looked identical to hope until you stood in the middle of nowhere holding neither. A woman approached. Older, maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back severe and eyes that had clearly seen too much frontier bullshit to be shocked by much anymore. She wore a simple brown dress and a coat that had been mended more times than replaced. "You plan on standing here till you freeze, or you got some survival instinct left?" Evelyn tried again. Managed a whisper, like, "Save it." The woman's voice wasn't cruel, just practical. "I'm Ruth Callahan. I run the boarding house on 2nd Street. You need a room. I got one. $3 a week, meals included. You need work. I can point you toward it. But nobody in this town gives handouts, and most of them are mean as snakes if they think you're weak." Evelyn nodded, not trusting even her whisper. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Christ, you really can't talk, can you?" Clayton wasn't lying about that part, at least. She picked up one handle of the trunk. "Come on, then, before someone decides to rob you blind. This ain't Philadelphia." The boarding house sat at the edge of what passed for Dry Hollow's main street, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together by people too tired to care about aesthetics. Everything leaned slightly, worn down by wind that never stopped, and winters that killed the unprepared. Ruth's place was cleaner than most, at least. 2 stories, white paint peeling, but the windows looked solid and smoke rose steady from the chimney. Inside smelled like coffee and old wood and something cooking that made Evelyn's stomach clench with hunger she'd been ignoring since dawn. "2nd floor, end of the hall," Ruth said, leading her upstairs that creaked with every step. "Bathroom shared. Hot water on Tuesdays and Saturdays if you're willing to haul it yourself. Don't steal from other guests, and don't bring men up here. Not that you look like the type. $3, first week up front." Evelyn counted out the money with trembling fingers. Ruth took it without comment, then handed her a key. "Supper's at 6. You miss it. You don't eat. Breakfast is 7. Same rule." She paused at the door. "One more thing. People here don't got patience for delicate Eastern ladies. You want to survive winter, you'll need to work. There's a tailor shop down the street, Han's place. Chinese fellow, been here longer than most of these bastards, but they still treat him like dirt. He might have sewing work if you got the skill. Otherwise, there's laundry, cleaning, cooking for the saloons. None of it's pleasant." But it's what das wants." "Thank you," Evelyn managed, barely audible. Ruth's expression softened just slightly. "Don't thank me yet. You ain't made it through your first week." The room was small. Narrow bed, 1 chair, a wash basin, a window that looked out on the back alley where someone had abandoned a wagon with a broken wheel. Evelyn sat on the bed and stared at that wagon for a long time, thinking about things that break and get left behind. Her voice had been everything once. She'd sung in church choirs, at society gatherings, at her sister's wedding 3 years before the fever came. People had called it remarkable, not just pretty, but powerful. The kind of voice that could fill a room and make people stop talking, stop moving, just to listen. Then last spring, the illness hit. Started with a cough, became pneumonia. The fever nearly killed her, and when she finally woke up in the hospital, her throat felt like someone had taken broken glass to it from the inside. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive. They said her vocal cords were scarred. They said she'd probably never sing again and speaking would always hurt, always sound damaged. Lucky, they'd called it. When Clayton's letters arrived 6 months later, found through a matrimonial service her aunt had secretly contacted, they'd felt like salvation. He'd written about his successful cattle business, his large ranch, his desire for an educated Eastern wife who could help him build something respectable in Wyoming territory. He'd seemed kind in his letters, understanding. He'd said her voice didn't matter, that he valued intelligence and character. More lies. She'd seen his face when she stepped off that train, the way his expression shifted from anticipation to disappointment to disgust in the span of 3 seconds. She'd tried to speak, to explain, to apologize for not being what he'd imagined, and he'd called her broken goods, in front of everyone. Evelyn lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until the light outside faded to gray, then black. She didn't cry, couldn't afford to. Tears were for people who had time to feel sorry for themselves. She had maybe 6 weeks before her money ran out completely. The tailor shop was smaller than she'd expected, wedged between a general store and a barber shop that doubled as the town's unofficial surgery when someone got shot or kicked by a horse. The sign above the door read, "Han and Son Tailoring," in letters that had been repainted recently enough to still look crisp. Evelyn pushed the door open. A bell chimed. The man behind the counter looked up from a jacket he was mending. He was perhaps 60, with gray threading through his black hair and hands that moved with the precision of someone who'd spent 50 years perfecting a craft. His face showed the particular kind of tiredness that came from decades of being treated as less than human by people who needed his skills but refused to respect them. "Help you?" His English carried an accent but was perfectly clear. Evelyn approached the counter, pulled out the small notepad and pencil she'd started carrying, wrote, "I need work. I can sew." Han studied the note, then studied her. "You're the one Clayton Mercer rejected. Everyone's talking about it." She felt her face burn but nodded. "You any good?" She wrote, "My grandmother taught me. I made my own wedding dress. Let me see your hands. See your—" She held them out. He examined her fingers with the same care he'd probably use evaluating fabric. "No calluses. You've done fine work, not labor." He looked at her face. "You really can't talk." She shook her head, then managed a whisper. "Barely. Don't strain yourself. I heard what happened." He set down the jacket. "I got mending work. Frontier men are hard on clothes. Tiers, buttons, hems. Nothing fancy. I pay $2 a week, 6 days. You work here, in the shop. I don't got time to deliver and collect." $2 wasn't enough to cover her room and food, but it was something. She wrote, "I'll take it. You start tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." She nodded and turned to go. "Miss Whitmore?" She looked back. Han's expression hadn't softened much, but something in his eyes suggested understanding. This town chews up people who show weakness. You want to survive? You'll need to develop a thick skin fast, and you'll need to ignore about 90% of what people say about you, because they're going to say plenty. Over the next 3 weeks, Evelyn learned that Han wasn't exaggerating. The women of Dry Hollow treated her like a curiosity at best and an object lesson at worst. They'd come into the shop ostensibly to pick up mending, but really to stare at the silent bride and whisper to each other just loud enough for her to hear. Heard she used to sing opera in Philadelphia. Well, she won't be singing anything now. Clayton said she can barely speak at all. Imagine being married to that. Imagine being so desperate you'd travel across the country for a man you'd never met. My husband says Clayton's smart to have refused her. What use is a wife who can't even call for help? Evelyn kept her head down and focused on her work. The mending was endless. Ranchers and railroad workers and miners who destroyed clothes faster than they could be replaced. She repaired tiers and canvas work pants, replaced buttons on wool shirts, hemmed dresses for the few women in town who could afford new fabric. Her fingers developed calluses. Her back ached from hunching over the work table. But the routine gave her something to focus on besides the constant, gnawing awareness that she was alone in a hostile place with no real plan beyond surviving one day at a time. Ruth, at least, wasn't cruel. The boarding house owner maintained her gruff practicality, but occasionally left extra bread at Evelyn's door, or didn't charge her the full rate for a week when work had been slow. They didn't have conversations. Evelyn's voice made that too difficult. But a kind of mutual understanding developed between two women who'd both learned that frontier life didn't reward vulnerability. Clayton, meanwhile, made sure everyone remembered his rejection. He was a regular presence on Dry Hollow's main street, loud and confident, surrounded by men who laughed at his jokes and women who smiled at his attention. He'd sometimes walk past the tailor shop's window and make a point of looking away, as if the mere sight of Evelyn disgusted him. Once, he came in to pick up a repaired saddle blanket. Evelyn was alone in the shop. Han had stepped out to deliver finished work to the boarding house. Clayton set the claim ticket on the counter without looking at her. "The blanket. Hurry up." She found it in the back, folded neatly, the tear Han had repaired nearly invisible, brought it to the counter. Clayton still wouldn't look at her. "4 bits, right?" She nodded. He threw the coins down, metal ringing against wood. Started to leave, then paused at the door, turned back. "You know what your problem is?" His voice was casual, almost friendly. That made it worse. "You thought you could come out here and trick some lonely rancher into taking care of you. Thought you could hide what you really are until it was too late for him to back out." He smiled and it didn't reach his eyes. "But I'm smarter than that. I could tell the second I saw you that you'd be nothing but dead weight, a burden, so I saved myself a lifetime of regret." Evelyn stood very still, her hands pressed flat against the counter to keep them from shaking. "You should have stayed in Philadelphia," Clayton continued. "Whatever charity case took you in back there, at least they knew what they were getting. Out here, you're just taking up space someone useful could occupy." He left, the door slamming behind him. Evelyn stood at the counter for a long time, staring at the 4 coins he'd thrown down. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw something, to let out the rage building in her chest like a trapped animal. But she couldn't scream, could barely speak. So she picked up the coins, put them in the cash box, and went back to mending a miner's torn shirt. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Evelyn made a decision. She would not leave Dry Hollow. Not because she had anywhere else to go. She didn't. Not because she liked it here. She hated almost everything about this frozen, hostile place. But because Clayton Mercer expected her to fail and disappear. Because everyone in this town looked at her like she was already dead. And something in her, some stubborn, furious part that had survived fever and loss and humiliation, refused to give them that satisfaction. She didn't know how yet, didn't have a plan. But she would find a way to survive this place. Not just survive, she'd find a way to prove every single one of them wrong. The man who walked into the tailor shop on a cold February afternoon was the tallest person Evelyn had ever seen. 6.5 feet, easily. Broad shoulders that barely fit through the door frame. He wore rancher's clothes, canvas pants, a heavy wool coat, work boots that had seen serious use. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outside, with lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. Dark hair, dark eyes, maybe 30 years old. He carried a torn saddle blanket. Han greeted him, but the man didn't respond. Just set the blanket on the counter and pointed at the tear, a long rip along one edge where the fabric had caught on something sharp. Han tried again, louder. "Mr. Ryder, I can fix this by—" The man still didn't respond. He pulled out a small notepad and pencil, similar to what Evelyn carried, and wrote something. Han read it and nodded, wrote back. They communicated through notes for a few minutes, discussing price and timing. The man paid for the repair, took his receipt, and left without having spoken a word. "Caleb Ryder," Han said after he'd gone, noticing Evelyn's curious expression. "Runs a ranch up past the Blackstone Hills. Been deaf since he was a boy. Prairie fever nearly killed him when he was 7, same one that killed his parents and 2 sisters. Just burned out his hearing on the way through." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, maybe. Or kinship. "He comes to town maybe once a month for supplies," Han continued. "Most people think he's stupid because he can't hear them. They talk about him like he's not even there. But he's got one of the best-run ranches in the territory. Just does it all alone, mostly because nobody wants to work for a deaf man. The next time Caleb Ryder came into the shop, Evelyn was the one at the counter. He set down a bundle of clothes, 2 shirts with torn sleeves, a pair of pants with a split seam, pulled out his notepad to write the usual information. Evelyn took the pad from him gently, wrote, "I can't speak either. Illness damaged my throat." He looked at her, really looked, for the first time. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity. She'd seen enough pity to recognize it. This was different. Understanding, maybe. Or just the acknowledgement of finding someone else who existed in the spaces between words. He took the pad back. Wrote, "People treat you different?" She nodded, then wrote, "Like I'm broken. Me too." It was the strangest conversation Evelyn had ever had. No voices, no sound, except the scratch of pencil on paper and the wind rattling the shop's windows. But it felt more honest than anything she'd experienced since arriving in Wyoming. They wrote back and forth while she examined his clothes, discussing repairs and costs and timing. Practical things. Nothing deep. But when he left, he nodded to her with something that almost looked like respect. It was such a small thing. But it was the first time since stepping off that train that someone in Dry Hollow had treated her like a person instead of a problem. March brought false spring, days where the temperature climbed above freezing and people started believing winter might actually end. Evelyn had been in Dry Hollow for 2 months. She'd learned the rhythms of the town, the patterns of who came into the shop and when, which customers left tips, and which ones tried to shortchange Han on principle. She'd saved $11. Not enough to leave, but enough to feel slightly less desperate. Caleb Ryder came in more frequently, always with mending or repairs, but Evelyn suspected he had clothes at home that weren't damaged. He'd arrive, exchange written notes with her, sometimes stay for 20 minutes just writing back and forth about nothing important. He told her about his ranch through careful pencil sketches, the layout of the buildings, the number of cattle, the way the land rolled toward the hills. She told him about Philadelphia, about the family she'd lost, about singing in churches that seemed impossibly far away now. Neither of them mentioned their respective silences directly again. They didn't need to. It existed between them like a shared language nobody else spoke. The town noticed. "That mute girl and the deaf rancher," someone said loudly enough for Evelyn to hear as she walked to the general store one afternoon. "Match made in hell, I suppose. 2 cripples together. Maybe they'll produce normal children, even if they can't talk to them." Evelyn kept walking, her face burning, her hands clenched into fists in her pockets. Ruth found her sitting on the boarding house steps that evening, staring at nothing. "You're making friends," Ruth observed, settling onto the step beside her. "Or whatever you'd call what's happening with Caleb Ryder." Evelyn pulled out her notepad, wrote, "People are talking. People are always talking. That's what small towns do. Talk and judge and make everyone else's business their entertainment." Ruth lit a cigarette, offering one to Evelyn, who declined. "Caleb's a good man. Smart. Built that ranch from nothing after his family died. Does better business than half the ranchers around here, even if they won't admit it. Clayton hates him. Clayton hates anyone who doesn't need him or fear him, and Caleb's never given a damn what Clayton thinks, which makes it worse." She exhaled smoke into the cold air. "You thinking about courting him?" Evelyn felt her face heat. Wrote, "I don't know what I'm doing." "Fair enough. Neither does anyone else, usually." Ruth stood, grinding out the cigarette under her boot. "Just be careful. This town doesn't like different. You and Caleb together? That's different squared. Some folks won't tolerate it." 2 weeks later, Caleb invited her to visit his ranch. He wrote the invitation during one of his visits to the shop, his handwriting careful and slightly uncertain. "I know it's far, but if you want to see it, maybe Sunday?" Evelyn's first instinct was no. It wasn't proper. It wasn't safe. She barely knew him. But then she thought about spending another Sunday trapped in town, sitting alone in her room or walking streets where everyone stared and whispered. She wrote, "How far?" 2 hours by wagon. I'll bring you back before dark." Sunday morning arrived cold and clear. Caleb pulled up to the boarding house in a well-maintained wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He nodded to her, not smiling. She'd learned he wasn't much for smiling, but his eyes showed something that might have been anticipation. Ruth watched from the porch as Evelyn climbed up to the wagon seat. "You got a gun?" Ruth called. Evelyn shook her head. Ruth disappeared inside, returned with a small revolver, handed it up to Evelyn with a box of ammunition. "Probably won't need it, but probably isn't definitely. Know how to shoot?" Evelyn shook her head again. "Then don't point it at anything unless you mean to kill it. And if you mean to kill it, make sure you hit it." She looked at Caleb. "You have her back by sundown, or I'm coming after you with something bigger than that pea shooter." Caleb just nodded and clicked the horses into motion. The ride north took them out of Dry Hollow's immediate vicinity and into the kind of landscape that made Evelyn understand why people called this territory both beautiful and brutal. Rolling plains stretched to distant mountains, the grass brown and dead from winter, but showing hints of green underneath where snow had melted. The sky went on forever, bigger than any sky she'd known in Philadelphia, empty except for hawks circling in the distance. Caleb didn't try to write while driving, just focused on the road, barely a road really, more like a suggestion of a path worn by repeated wagon wheels. Evelyn sat beside him, watching the landscape roll past, feeling something in her chest unknot slightly with every mile they put between themselves and town. The Ryder Ranch sat in a shallow valley protected by low hills on three sides. Not huge by frontier standards, maybe 400 acres, Caleb would write later, but well maintained. Fences in good repair, a barn that looked solid, a small house, single story, with smoke rising from the chimney suggesting he'd kept the fire going before leaving. Cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, maybe 60 head, all looking healthy despite the hard winter. He helped her down from the wagon with surprising gentleness for someone so large, then gestured toward the house. Inside was cleaner than she'd expected. Simple furniture, a wood stove keeping everything warm, shelves lined with books and ranch ledgers. The kind of space that belonged to someone who lived alone but hadn't given up on comfort entirely. Caleb made coffee, surprisingly good coffee, and they sat at the small table with their notepads between them like always. "You live here alone?" she wrote. He nodded. Wrote, "Since I was 16, nobody wants to work for someone they can't yell at." "You run everything yourself?" "Mostly. Sometimes hire help for branding or moving cattle. But they never stay long. Why not?" He hesitated, then wrote, "People get frustrated. They think I'm stupid because I can't hear them. Or they think I'm dangerous because I might not hear danger coming. Easier to work alone." Evelyn understood that particular brand of loneliness. Different reasons, same result. "You built this yourself?" "My father started it. Before the fever. After they died, the bank almost took it. But I figured out how to make it work." His handwriting grew smaller, faster, like he was embarrassed by the admission. "Read everything I could find about cattle and ranching. Studied what successful operations did. Made a lot of mistakes. But eventually made enough right decisions that it survived. It's impressive." He looked at her for a long moment, then wrote, "Nobody's ever said that before." They spent the afternoon walking the property. Caleb showed her the cattle operation, the barn where he stored equipment and supplies, the garden plot he'd prepared for spring planting, communicated through gestures and quick notes, developing a shorthand that worked better than words sometimes. He was patient when she didn't understand something, careful to make sure she wasn't cold or tired. Not in the smothering way men sometimes treated women they considered fragile, but in the way of someone who understood that taking care of another person was different from controlling them. As the sun started dropping toward the western hills, they sat on the porch of his house drinking more coffee, watching the light turn the plains golden. Caleb wrote, "Can I ask what happened to your voice?" She'd known the question would come eventually. Wrote, "Fever last spring, pneumonia, damaged my vocal cords permanently." "You used to sing? How did you know? You hold yourself like someone who used to perform." "Same way I watch people's mouths move like I'm still trying to hear them." She felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody had noticed that before. Nobody had looked at her closely enough to see the ghost of who she used to be. "I miss it," she wrote. "Not just singing, but being heard. Being able to communicate without fighting for every word. I know, 2 words. But they carried the weight of someone who'd spent 25 years living in a world that wasn't built for him." Evelyn wrote, "Do you ever get tired of people treating you like you're less than them? Every day. Then why stay?" He took a long time to respond, staring out at his ranch, at the land he'd fought to keep. Finally wrote, "Because this is mine. They can think whatever they want. But they can't take this from me. I built something here, something that works. That's enough. The ride back to Dry Hollow happened in comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of wagon wheels and wind. When they reached the boarding house, full dark had fallen, but Ruth's porch light was burning. Caleb helped her down. Their hands touched briefly, and neither pulled away immediately. He wrote one last note. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me." "Again sometime?" She smiled, the first real smile she'd managed in Wyoming, and nodded. Ruth was waiting inside with raised eyebrows. "Well?" Evelyn pulled out her pad, wrote, "He's kind." "Kind doesn't keep you warm in winter," Ruth said pragmatically. "But it's a start, I suppose." That night, lying in her narrow bed, Evelyn thought about Caleb Ryder's ranch, about the life he'd built despite everyone expecting him to fail, about the way he'd looked at her like she was a person worth knowing instead of a problem to be solved or a curiosity to be examined. She thought about Clayton Mercer's face when he'd rejected her at the train station, and she thought about the fact that maybe, just maybe, being unwanted by the wrong person was the best thing that could have happened to her. Because if Clayton had married her, she would have spent her life trying to be small and quiet and useful, trying to earn his approval by disappearing. But Caleb Ryder didn't want her to disappear. He wanted someone who understood what it meant to exist outside the lines of what people considered normal. And for the first time since her voice broke, Evelyn started thinking about the future as something other than just surviving until tomorrow. Spring came to Wyoming territory in fits and starts, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, the land slowly waking up from winter's death grip. Evelyn continued working at the tailor shop, her skills improving as Han taught her more complex repairs and alterations. Her savings grew slowly but steadily, and every Sunday, Caleb Ryder drove 2 hours to pick her up and bring her to his ranch. They fell into a rhythm. She'd help him with correspondence, writing letters to cattle buyers, organizing his business records, handling the communication aspects of ranching that his deafness made difficult. He taught her to ride horses, to recognize weather patterns, to understand the rhythms of cattle management. It wasn't romance like in the novels Evelyn had read as a girl. There were no passionate declarations or dramatic gestures. Just two people learning to exist in the same space comfortably, building something that looked like partnership. But the town was watching. And Clayton Mercer was getting angry. Clayton Mercer's first move came on a Tuesday morning in late April, when the mud had finally started drying enough that wagons could travel without getting stuck every 100 yards. Evelyn was working alone in the tailor shop when 3 women entered. She recognized them immediately, wives of Clayton's business associates, women who'd never brought mending work before because they considered Han's shop beneath them. The tallest one, Margaret Preston, set a bundle of clothes on the counter without greeting Evelyn. "We need these altered by Friday." Evelyn picked up her notepad, but Margaret spoke before she could write. "We know you can't talk. Everyone knows. That's not why we're here." Margaret's smile was sharp as cut glass. "We're here because Clayton told us about your situation with Caleb Ryder." The other 2 women watched Evelyn like hawks studying prey. "It's inappropriate," Margaret continued. "A single woman spending time alone with a man, especially one who can't even communicate properly. People are starting to wonder about your morals, about what exactly happens at that ranch of his." Evelyn's hand tightened around the pencil. She wrote, "We're friends." "Friends?" Margaret laughed, cold and brittle. "Is that what you call it in Philadelphia? Because here we have other words for women who visit men unchaperoned." One of the other women leaned forward. "Clayton says you came here to trap a husband, that you lied about your condition to trick him into marriage. Now you're doing the same thing to Caleb Ryder." Evelyn's face burned. She wrote, her handwriting getting messier, "That's not true." "Isn't it? You show up, damaged goods nobody wants, and suddenly you're spending every Sunday with the only man in town desperate enough not to care?" Margaret's voice dropped lower, venomous. "We're warning you, Miss Whitmore. Caleb Ryder may be deaf, but he's still a man with property and resources. If you're planning to take advantage of his limitations to secure yourself a position, you'll find this town doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior." "We protect our own," the third woman added, "even the broken ones." They left the bundle of clothes and walked out, leaving Evelyn shaking behind the counter, her notepad covered in words she'd written and crossed out, trying to find some response that would matter. When Han returned 20 minutes later, He found her sitting on the floor behind the counter, her head resting against the wall, her hands balled into fists. He didn't ask what happened, just made tea and sat beside her until she could breathe normally again. Finally, Evelyn pulled out her notepad, wrote, "They think I'm using him." Han read it and sighed. Of course they do. People like Margaret Preston can't imagine a world where two people who are different might just understand each other. Everything has to be a scheme or a scandal. Should I stop visiting him? Do you want to stop? She shook her head. Then don't. The moment you let people like that control your choices, you've already lost. He stood, his knees cracking. But understand something. This is just the beginning. Clayton's got his pride hurt, and men like him don't let go of grudges. He's going to make things difficult. Han was right. Over the next 3 weeks, business at the tailor shop dropped by half. Women who'd regularly brought mending suddenly stopped coming. Men who'd paid Han for repairs for years started taking their work to a new seamstress who'd opened a shop across town. A woman who, everyone noted loudly, was properly married and didn't associate with questionable types. Han never blamed Evelyn directly, but she saw the worry in his eyes when he counted the money at the end of each week. Saw him looking at his ledgers with the expression of a man watching something he'd built for decades slowly crumble. She offered to leave. He refused. "I'm 63 years old," he told her through written notes one evening after they'd closed up shop. "I've survived this town's racism, its economic crashes, and 2 fires that burned down half the main street. I'll survive Clayton Mercer's tantrum too. You need this job. You stay." But the pressure kept building. Ruth pulled Evelyn aside one night at the boarding house. "There's talk," she said bluntly, "about you and Caleb. Some of Clayton's friends have been suggesting maybe the territorial judge should look into Caleb's competency, saying a deaf man running a ranch alone is dangerous, that he might not be fit to manage his own affairs." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Wrote, "They can't do that. They can try. Out here the law is whatever the judge says it is, and judges listen to wealthy men with influence. Clayton's been buying drinks, making donations, spreading money around, building support. Why does he care so much?" Ruth lit a cigarette, thinking. "Pride, mostly. You rejected his second attempt to fix his mistake. You didn't even know he tried, did you? He sent someone to offer you another chance at marriage 2 weeks after the first rejection. You never responded because you never got the message. I sent the messenger away." She exhaled smoke. Men like Clayton think the world owes them. When it doesn't deliver, they get mean. What do I do? Honestly, I don't know. But you should probably tell Caleb what's happening. He deserves to know people are targeting him because of you. The next Sunday, Evelyn arrived at the ranch and immediately pulled out her notepad. Wrote everything: the women at the shop, the dropping business, the rumors about Caleb's competency, Clayton's campaign against them. Caleb read it all, his face getting darker with each sentence. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at nothing for a long moment. Finally, he wrote, "I'm sorry. Why are you apologizing? Because you're dealing with this because of me. If you'd never started coming here, Clayton would have left you alone eventually. That's not true. He would have found some other way to make me miserable. At least this way I'm not alone." Caleb looked at her, something complicated in his expression. Wrote, "You could stop coming. Might make things easier." "For who?" "For you." Evelyn took the pencil from him, wrote carefully, underlining certain words for emphasis. "I don't want easier. I want this. Us. Whatever this is. Do you want me to stop coming?" He shook his head immediately, almost violently. "Then we figure out how to handle Clayton together." But neither of them had any idea how to fight a man who controlled half the town's economy. The situation escalated faster than Evelyn expected. 2 weeks later, Caleb came to town for supplies and found that Morrison's general store, where he'd been buying feed, tools, and equipment for 15 years, suddenly wouldn't extend him credit anymore. Morrison, a thin man with permanently worried eyes, wouldn't meet Caleb's gaze while he wrote out the explanation. "Sorry, new policy. Cash only for all customers." Caleb wrote back, "Since when?" "Since this morning." "Is this about Evelyn?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I got a business to run. Clayton Mercer's got friends. He suggested maybe I should be more careful about who I do business with. Said people who associate with, Well, he had some unkind terms, might not be reliable. Caleb slammed his hand on the counter hard enough to make Morrison jump. Wrote, I've paid every bill on time for 15 years. I know, but Clayton's got influence with the bank. I can't afford to upset him. I'm sorry, Ryder, really, but cash only from now on, and if I were you, I'd consider doing your business in one of the other towns. Maybe that'd be easier for everyone. Caleb left without the supplies he needed, drove straight to the tailor shop and found Evelyn working on a torn work shirt. The look on his face told her something had gone wrong even before he started writing. She read his account of what happened at Morrison's, her anger rising with each sentence. When he finished, she grabbed her own pencil and wrote, This is my fault. No, this is Clayton being a bastard. There's a difference. What are you going to do? I don't know. I've got maybe 6 weeks of feed left. After that, I'll have to buy from suppliers 2 towns over. That means higher costs, longer trips, time away from the ranch. It might work short term, but it's not sustainable. Evelyn stared at the notepad, thinking, then wrote, We need to fight back. How? I don't know yet, but we can't just let him destroy everything. Over the next month, Clayton's campaign intensified. Other businesses started refusing Caleb's service. The bank, where Caleb had kept his accounts for years, suddenly found irregularities that required additional documentation and fees. Men who'd previously hired on for seasonal work stopped responding to his offers. The isolation was deliberate and thorough. Han's shop continued to lose business. The new seamstress across town made pointed comments about proper Christian values and knowing who to associate with. Several of Han's longtime customers told him they'd have to take their work elsewhere until he cleaned up his business practices. Evelyn watched the man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing slowly lose the livelihood he'd spent 40 years building. She offered again to quit. Again, he refused. If I give in now, Han told her, I'm telling everyone in this town that bullies win. That money and influence matter more than doing right. I'm too old and too tired to live with that lesson. But Evelyn could see the strain wearing on him, could see it wearing on Caleb too. Every Sunday when he arrived looking more exhausted, more worried, more defeated. They were losing, and everyone knew it. Then the drought came. May gave way to June with almost no rain. The grass that had greened up in spring started turning brown again. Water sources began drying up. Ranchers watched nervously as their cattle grew thin and irritable. If we don't get rain soon, Ruth said one evening, studying the cloudless sky with worried eyes, we're going to have serious problems. Dry grass plus lightning strikes equals wildfire. And wildfire out here doesn't stop until it hits something that won't burn. 3 days later, lightning hit a dead tree 15 miles north of Dry Hollow. By evening, smoke filled the sky. The fire moved faster than anyone anticipated, driven by wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. It swept through the northern valley like a living thing, consuming dry grass and dead timber with terrifying speed. Ranches directly in its path had maybe hours to evacuate. The town mobilized in the chaotic way frontier communities did when disaster struck, half planning, half panic. Men formed bucket brigades. Women organized wagons to evacuate children and elderly. The sheriff tried to coordinate rescue efforts while simultaneously fighting the urge to abandon everything and run. Clayton Mercer's ranch sat right in the fire's path. Evelyn was helping Ruth pack emergency supplies when someone burst into the boarding house shouting that Clayton had workers trapped in the northern pasture. The fire had moved faster than expected, cutting off their escape route. Clayton had already evacuated his main ranch with his valuable breeding stock, but 6 men remained trapped beyond a wall of flames. Someone needs to get them, the messenger said, his face covered in soot. But the route's blocked. You'd have to go around through the canyon, and nobody knows that terrain well enough except Caleb Ryder, Ruth finished. She looked at Evelyn. He knows every inch of that country. Used to run cattle through there before he consolidated closer to his homestead. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and ran. The street was chaos. People running, horses screaming, smoke turning the afternoon dark as twilight. She found Caleb near the livery stable, helping load a wagon with children being evacuated south. She grabbed his arm, pulled out her notepad, wrote as fast as her shaking hands allowed. Clayton's men trapped. Northern pasture. Need someone who knows the canyon route. Please. Caleb read it. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the smoke filling the northern sky, then back at her. Wrote, Those are Clayton's men. I know. He tried to destroy everything I have. I know. But they're still people. And you're the only one who can reach them. For a long moment, Caleb just stared at the notepad. Evelyn could see him weighing it. The justice of letting Clayton's men face consequences of their employer's cruelty versus the reality of 6 human beings about to burn to death through no fault of their own. Finally, he shoved the notepad in his pocket and started toward the horses. Evelyn followed. He turned, shook his head, pointed back toward town. She shook her head right back. Wrote, "You can't hear the fire. You'll need someone to watch behind you. I'm coming. Too dangerous. Then we'll be in danger together. Stop arguing." They didn't have time for a longer debate. Caleb swung onto his horse, a big roan gelding named Judge, and pulled Evelyn up behind him. Another rancher named Tom Parker, younger than Caleb, but brave enough or stupid enough to volunteer, mounted his own horse. Ruth ran up as they were leaving, pressed the small revolver into Evelyn's hand. "Don't die," she said simply. "I don't have time to train another boarder." The ride north took them into hell. Smoke obscured everything within minutes. The air tasted like burning grass and terror. Evelyn wrapped a wet cloth around her face. Ruth had shoved it at her before they left, but it barely helped. Every breath burned. Her eyes watered constantly. Caleb rode with absolute confidence, despite not being able to hear the fire roaring around them. He navigated by sight and memory, taking them through paths Evelyn couldn't even see until they were right on top of them. Around burning trees, through creek beds almost dry, across rocky terrain that would break a horse's leg if you misjudged by 6 inches. Tom Parker followed, occasionally shouting warnings about flames behind them. Warnings Caleb couldn't hear but that Evelyn could relay by grabbing his shoulder and pointing. They reached the canyon entrance just as the wind shifted. Flames that had been a quarter-mile east suddenly swept west, cutting off the direct route. Tom shouted something, lost in the roar, and pointed at an alternative path, barely visible through the smoke. Caleb nodded and turned Judge toward it. The canyon itself was narrower than Evelyn expected. Steep walls on both sides, smoke funneling through like water through a pipe. The fire hadn't reached here yet, but she could feel the heat building. Could hear, even if Caleb couldn't, the ominous sound of trees cracking as they burned and fell somewhere behind them. When they finally emerged on the north side, they found Clayton's 6 workers huddled in a small depression in the ground, surrounded by fire on 3 sides. The men looked up with expressions of desperate hope. One of them, a red-haired man named Sullivan, started shouting, then stopped when he realized Caleb couldn't hear him. He grabbed a stick and scratched in the dirt. Trapped 2 hours. Thought nobody coming. Caleb wrote back, "Canyon route still clear. Follow close. Stay together." Getting 6 men, 3 horses, and themselves back through the canyon turned into a nightmare that Evelyn would replay in her mind for years. The fire had advanced during the rescue, cutting off their original path. Caleb had to improvise, taking them through routes even he wasn't completely sure about, reading the land and the fire patterns with skills Evelyn didn't fully understand. Twice they had to backtrack when flames blocked their path. Once, a burning tree fell across the trail 50 feet ahead of them, missing them by seconds. The horses panicked. Tom Parker's mount threw him, and he hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of him. They couldn't stop. Evelyn jumped down, helped Tom back into his saddle, while Caleb kept the other horses moving. Sullivan pulled her back up behind Caleb just as sparks started landing around them. The route back took them through areas where the fire had already passed, the ground still hot enough to feel through the horses' hooves, smoke so thick Evelyn couldn't see Judge's ears in front of her. She pressed her face against Caleb's back and held on, trusting him completely because there was no alternative. At one point, she felt him go rigid. She looked up and saw why. The canyon walls had collapsed ahead of them, blocking the path with burning debris. No way through, no way back. Sullivan grabbed Caleb's shoulder, pointed desperately at a narrow side trail Evelyn hadn't even noticed. Barely wide enough for a horse, climbing up instead of through. Caleb looked at it, looked at the trapped men, made a decision. They went up. The trail was more suggestion than reality, clinging to the canyon wall at an angle that made Evelyn's stomach drop. One misstep meant falling 50 feet into burning rubble. Judge climbed carefully, his hooves finding purchase on rock Evelyn couldn't distinguish from air. The other horses followed. Tom Parker's mount slipped once, scrambled, found footing. One of the workers was praying, another was crying, Sullivan was just grimly holding on. When they finally reached the top and broke out of the canyon onto open ground north of the fire, Evelyn looked back and saw the path they'd just climbed already engulfed in flames. 30 seconds later, and they'd all be dead. They rode hard for another 20 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the fire, until Caleb finally stopped in a clearing where the smoke was thin enough to breathe. The men dismounted, some collapsing, others just standing there shaking. Sullivan walked to Caleb, grabbed his hand, shook it hard. Wrote in the dirt, "You saved us." Caleb just nodded, already checking the horses for injuries. Evelyn slid off Judge and immediately bent over, coughing so hard she thought she might vomit. Her lungs burned. Her eyes were nearly swollen shut from smoke. Her hands were blistered where she'd grabbed Judge's mane to hold on, but they were alive. All of them, against odds that shouldn't have allowed it. Tom Parker looked at Caleb with something approaching awe. "How the hell did you navigate through that? I've got full hearing and I couldn't have done half of what you just did." Caleb pulled out his notepad. Wrote, "You learn to pay attention to things most people ignore." The ride back to Dry Hollow took 3 hours. The fire had moved east, still burning but no longer threatening the town directly. When they came over the rise and saw the lights of civilization, Sullivan started crying again. They arrived after midnight to find half the town still awake, watching the smoke, waiting for news. Someone saw them coming and shouted. Within minutes, a crowd gathered. Clayton Mercer pushed through, his face a mask of relief that cracked into something uglier when he saw who'd brought his workers back. "You," he said to Sullivan. "Report. What happened?" Sullivan looked at Caleb, then at Clayton. When he spoke, his voice carried across the crowd. "Ryder saved us. We were trapped, no way out, fire on 3 sides. Mercer, you left us there." Clayton's face went red. "That's not... I was securing the breeding stock, essential assets." "You left 6 men to die for cows," another worker said, stepping forward. "Ryder rode into an inferno to pull us out. Him and this woman here," he gestured at Evelyn, "while you were running south with your expensive bulls." The crowd's muttering grew louder. Clayton's voice rose. "Ryder's deaf. He doesn't understand the risks. He got lucky." "Lucky?" Tom Parker laughed, harsh and disbelieving. "That wasn't luck. That was skill. He navigated through conditions I couldn't even track, found routes I didn't know existed, kept his head while the rest of us were panicking. That man's got abilities you'll never understand, Clayton." "He's defective," Clayton snapped. "Everyone knows it. You're all just emotional because you survived. Tomorrow you'll remember the truth, that hiring a deaf man is dangerous, that letting him run a ranch unsupervised is irresponsible, that—" "Shut up, Clayton." Ruth Callahan's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. She stepped forward, her face hard as stone. "Just shut your mouth for once. These men are telling you that Caleb Ryder is the bravest, most capable person in this territory, and all you can do is insult him. You're pathetic." Someone in the crowd said, "She's right." Someone else, "Ryder's a hero." Clayton looked around, seeing his control slipping. "You're all fools. Tomorrow, when the emotion fades, you'll see—" "We see fine now," Sullivan interrupted. "We see you abandoned us. We see who rode into fire to save us." He looked at Caleb. "I'm done working for you, Mercer. I'll take ranch work from Ryder if he'll have me." "Me too," another worker said, "and me." 4 of Clayton's 6 rescued workers quit on the spot. The crowd dispersed slowly, people drifting away to their homes, but talking, always talking. The story would spread. By morning, everyone in the territory would know what happened. Caleb stood beside Judge, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. Evelyn touched his arm, wrote, "You did it." "We did it," he wrote back. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. Something that acknowledged they'd crossed a line together that couldn't be uncrossed. Ruth appeared with food and coffee. "You two look like death. Eat, sleep. Try not to burn down my boarding house with your smoke-filled clothes." They ate mechanically, too tired to taste anything. When Evelyn finally made it to her room, she collapsed on the bed fully clothed and passed out before she could even pull off her boots. She woke at dawn to shouting in the street. The fire had been contained during the night. Damage assessment would take days, but the immediate danger had passed. More importantly, the story of the rescue had spread exactly as predicted. By the time Evelyn made it downstairs, 3 families had already come to the boarding house asking how to find Caleb Ryder's ranch. They wanted to thank him, they said, wanted to offer help rebuilding if he'd lost anything, wanted to hire on if he needed workers. Ruth directed them all north and looked at Evelyn with something approaching satisfaction. Sometimes the universe balances itself out, she said. Took its sweet time, but here we are. Over the next week, the shift in town attitudes became impossible to ignore. People who'd shunned Caleb started nodding to him on the street. Women who'd gossiped about Evelyn suddenly found themselves interested in bringing work to Han's shop again. The new seamstress across town lost half her customers in 3 days. Clayton Mercer tried to control the narrative, told anyone who'd listen that the rescue was overblown, that his workers were exaggerating, that proper ranchers didn't risk valuable human resources on dangerous rescue missions. But nobody was listening anymore. 4 days after the fire, Evelyn was working at the tailor shop when Clayton himself walked in. Han had stepped out. She was alone. Clayton stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his expression uglier than she'd ever seen it. "This is your fault," he said quietly. "All of it. You came here, broken and useless, and somehow you've turned this town against me." Evelyn reached for her notepad. He slapped it out of her hand. "I don't want to read your pathetic scrawling. I want you to understand something. This isn't over. You think one fire changes everything? It changes nothing. I still have money. I still have influence. And sooner or later, people will remember that Caleb Ryder is still a deaf rancher who can't hear danger coming, and you're still a woman who can't even speak well enough to call for help." He leaned closer. Evelyn could smell whiskey on his breath. "You should have married me when you had the chance," Clayton said. "I would have taken care of you, given you a place. Instead, you've chosen to embarrass me publicly, to align yourself with a defective man, to make me look like a fool. That's not something I forgive." Evelyn held very still, her heart hammering, her hands clenched into fists. Clayton smiled, cold and sharp. "You're both going to regret this, maybe not today, maybe not this week, but soon. I promise you that." He left without another word. Evelyn stood there shaking, staring at her notepad on the floor, trying to convince herself that Clayton was just angry, that his threats were empty, that everything would be fine now. But she didn't believe it. And when she told Caleb about it that Sunday, writing out every word Clayton had said, she could see he didn't believe it either. Caleb stared at the notepad where Evelyn had written Clayton's threats, his face going through emotions she'd learned to read over their months together, anger, worry, and something darker underneath. Finally, he wrote, "He's planning something, I know. We should be careful." Evelyn took the pencil back, wrote with more force than necessary. "I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of letting him control everything. What choice do we have?" She didn't have an answer. That was the problem. Clayton still owned half the businesses in town, still had connections to the territorial government, still wielded enough influence to make their lives miserable whenever he chose. The fire rescue had shifted public opinion, but opinion didn't pay bills or change laws. July brought heat that baked the ground hard as stone and made the previous drought look like nothing. The fire had consumed thousands of acres of grazing land, forcing ranchers to move cattle to areas already overgrazed. Water sources dried up, tempers ran short. Everyone waited for the next disaster because the frontier had taught them disasters always came in waves. Clayton's next move arrived on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Dawson showed up at the tailor shop with a folded paper in his hand and an apologetic expression on his weathered face. "Miss Whitmore, about all," he said, nodding to her. "I need you to read this." Evelyn took the paper. It was a legal notice, dense with territorial law language that took her 3 readings to understand fully. Someone had petitioned the territorial court to review Caleb Ryder's competency to manage his own affairs. The petition cited his deafness as evidence of diminished capacity, claimed he posed a danger to himself and any employees, referenced the fire rescue as reckless behavior, and requested the court appoint a legal guardian to oversee his ranch operations and financial decisions. The petitioner's name wasn't on the document, but Evelyn didn't need it written down. She looked at the sheriff and mouthed one word. "Clayton?" Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "I can't say who filed it. That's confidential until the hearing. But Miss Whitmore, between you and me, this stinks of politics. A competency hearing for a man who just saved 6 lives? Whose ranch has been profitable for 15 years? He shook his head. "Someone with money and connections is pushing this through." Evelyn's hands shook as she held the paper. She wrote, "When is the hearing?" 3 weeks. Ryder's been notified too. He'll need to appear before Judge Whitlock and demonstrate he's capable of managing his affairs. If the judge rules against him, they'll appoint a guardian who can make decisions about his property, his business, everything. Can they take his ranch? Not directly, but a guardian could decide to sell it for his own good. Could force him to accept business partnerships he doesn't want. Could basically strip him of legal autonomy. Dawson leaned against the counter, looking older than his 50-some years. I've seen this happen before. Usually to folks who inconvenience powerful people. The law gets used as a weapon. After the sheriff left, Evelyn sat behind the counter staring at the notice until Han returned from a delivery and found her there, tears running down her face silently, because crying was one of the few things her damaged voice couldn't make harder. Han read the document. His expression went cold. "This is evil," he said simply. "This is taking a man's life and crushing it because he dared to be better than people expected." Evelyn grabbed her notepad, wrote, "What do we do?" "I don't know, but we'd better figure it out fast." That afternoon, Evelyn closed the shop early and rode out to Caleb's ranch. She found him in the barn repairing a section of fence railing, moving with the methodical precision he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and she saw he already knew. Someone had delivered his copy of the notice. They sat at his kitchen table with their notepads between them, writing back and forth faster than they ever had before, words tumbling out in messy handwriting as they tried to make sense of something that made no sense. "This is because of me," Evelyn wrote. "If we'd never—" Caleb grabbed the pencil. "Don't. This is Clayton being a bastard. Nothing else. But what do we do? How do you fight this?" "I don't know. Show up at the hearing, I guess. Try to prove I'm competent." "You are competent. You run a better ranch than half the hearing men in this territory." "But I'm deaf." "To men like Clayton, that's all that matters." Evelyn stared at the notepad, frustration building in her chest like pressure in a boiler. She grabbed the pencil back. "No, we're not giving up. There has to be a way to fight this." "How?" "I can't even speak to defend myself. I'll have to write everything out while Clayton's lawyer tears me apart in front of the judge. You know how that'll look. Like I'm struggling, like I need help with basic communication. Then we get you a good lawyer. With what money?" "My savings barely cover the ranch expenses through winter. Lawyers that can stand up to Clayton's people cost more than I have." They wrote back and forth for 2 hours, circling the same problems without finding solutions. Evelyn could see the defeat settling into Caleb's posture, the way he hunched over the table like a man preparing for a blow he couldn't dodge. Finally, she wrote, "I won't let them take this from you." He looked at her with something close to despair. "You can't stop them. Watch me." But as Evelyn rode back to Dry Hollow that evening, she had no idea how to make that promise real. She had no money, no legal knowledge, no influence, just anger and desperation and the growing certainty that if they lost this fight, she'd lose more than just Caleb's ranch. She'd lose the only person who'd ever made her feel like silence wasn't the same as disappearing. Over the next week, she tried everything she could think of. She went to the sheriff, who sympathized but explained he had no authority over territorial court decisions. She visited the town lawyer, an old drunk named Perkins, who told her he wouldn't take a case against Clayton's interests for any amount of money, because professional suicide ain't in my job description. She even swallowed her pride and went to Margaret Preston, thinking maybe one of the women who'd confronted her might have influence with their husbands. Margaret listened to her written plea with an expression of mild contempt, and then said, "Perhaps if Mr. Ryder had been more careful about his associations, he wouldn't be in this position. I hope this serves as a lesson about the importance of propriety." Evelyn had walked away before she did something that would get her arrested. Ruth found her sitting on the boarding house steps that night, her notepad filled with crossed-out ideas and failed strategies. "You're beating yourself up over this," Ruth observed, settling down beside her with her usual cigarette. "I can see it eating you alive." Evelyn wrote, "I don't know how to help him. Maybe you can't. Maybe this is one of those situations where the bad guy wins because he's got more money and more friends in high places." Ruth took a long drag. "I've seen it happen before. Probably see it again." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No. But it's supposed to make you realistic about what you're up against. Ruth studied the glowing end of her cigarette. Though I'll say this, you've got one advantage Clayton doesn't expect. What? You've got nothing left to lose. People with nothing to lose can take risks. People with something to protect can't afford. Evelyn thought about that for a long time after Ruth went inside. Thought about what it meant to have nothing left to lose. Thought about the fact that she'd already lost her voice, her family, her home, any prospect of the life she'd imagined for herself. Clayton had taken his shot at destroying her dignity at the train station. He couldn't do worse than he'd already done, but he could still take everything from Caleb unless she found a way to stop him. The idea came to her 3 days before the hearing, born from desperation and the memory of her aunt in Philadelphia, who'd once said that the rich and powerful had one weakness. They believed their own superiority so completely that they never saw threats from people they'd already dismissed. Evelyn started writing. Not notes on a pad, but a proper document, pages and pages of careful script that took her 2 full days to complete. She wrote about Clayton's rejection at the train station, including details witnesses could confirm. She wrote about his campaign to isolate Caleb economically, including dates and businesses that had suddenly refused service. She wrote about the fire rescue and Clayton abandoning his workers, using Sullivan's account and the testimony of other survivors. Most importantly, she wrote about the competency petition itself, how it appeared immediately after Caleb's heroic rescue embarrassed Clayton publicly, how it targeted a man who'd successfully run a ranch for 15 years without incident, how it represented an abuse of territorial law to settle a personal vendetta. She made copies, gave one to Sullivan and the other rescued workers with instructions to deliver them to the judge before the hearing, gave one to Tom Parker to spread among the ranchers who'd started respecting Caleb after the rescue, gave one to Han to post in his shop window, and kept one for herself. "What are you planning?" Ruth asked when she saw Evelyn preparing multiple copies at the boarding house table. Evelyn wrote, "If they won't listen to Caleb, maybe they'll listen to everyone else. That's not how territorial courts work. The judge doesn't care about public opinion. Then I'll make him care." Ruth studied her for a long moment. "You're going to do something stupid, aren't you?" "Probably." "Good. About time someone in this town did." The night before the hearing, Caleb came to Dry Hollow and found Evelyn at the boarding house. Ruth, reading the situation correctly, made herself scarce. They sat in the common room with notepads between them and the weight of tomorrow pressing down on both of them. Caleb wrote, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." "What?" He hesitated, then wrote carefully, "Before you came here, I'd accepted that my life would always be small, that I'd run my ranch alone, grow old alone, die alone. I was okay with it. I'd made peace with being the person nobody wanted to know." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Then you showed up. And suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. Someone understood. Someone saw me as something other than broken, or defective, or pitiable." His handwriting got messier, faster. "If they take the ranch tomorrow, I'll survive. But I need you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life. Even with everything else, even with Clayton trying to destroy us, I wouldn't trade this for anything." Evelyn's vision blurred. She took the pencil, but her hands were shaking too hard to write clearly. Finally managed, "Don't talk like we've already lost. I'm being realistic." "No, you're giving up, and that's not the man who rode into a wildfire to save people who worked for his worst enemy." Caleb looked at her for a long time, then wrote, "What if I fight and still lose? Then at least you fought. At least you didn't let him take it without making him work for it. You're stronger than I am." "No, I'm just more stubborn. There's a difference." That got the ghost of a smile from him. He reached across the table and took her hand, no notepad between them for once, just the simple human contact of 2 people facing something terrible together. They sat like that until Ruth came back and told Caleb he needed to leave before people started talking even more than they already were. He nodded, squeezed Evelyn's hand once more, and walked out into the night. Evelyn went to her room and didn't sleep, just sat at her window watching the stars and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The train station, Clayton's rejection, the tailor shop, the first time Caleb had walked in with a torn saddle blanket, the fire rescue, all of it building toward tomorrow. She thought about her voice, lost to fever and scarring, how she'd believed losing it meant losing everything, how silence had felt like erasure. But silence could also be strength. Caleb had taught her that. Not speaking didn't mean not communicating. Not having a voice didn't mean having nothing to say. Tomorrow, she'd prove it. The territorial courthouse was a two-story building that also served as the town hall, land office, and on Sundays, overflow church space when the regular church couldn't hold everyone. By 9 in the morning, it was packed. Word had spread about the hearing. Ranchers filled the back rows. Workers from Caleb's rescue stood along the walls. Even some of Clayton's former employees showed up, looking uncomfortable but determined. Judge Whitlock was a stern man in his 60s who'd served on the territorial bench for 20 years. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for moving efficiently through cases because the territory had more legal disputes than judges to handle them. Clayton sat at the front with his lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne named Morrison, who wore an expensive suit and smiled like a snake. Clayton himself looked confident, relaxed, like this was already decided. Caleb sat alone at the defense table. He'd refused to beg anyone for legal help, said he'd represent himself. Evelyn could see the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. He looked like a man preparing to be executed. Judge Whitlock called the hearing to order. This is a competency review for Caleb Ryder. Petition number 447. Mr. Morrison, you may present the petitioner's case. Morrison stood smoothly. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Mr. Ryder, while no doubt a hard-working man, suffers from a significant disability that impairs his ability to safely manage a large ranch operation. His deafness creates dangerous situations for himself and anyone who works with him. He proceeded to lay out a case built on Clayton's money and connections. Medical experts who'd never met Caleb testified that deafness inherently limited competency. Business owners claimed Caleb had difficulty managing transactions. Morrison even twisted the fire rescue, calling it reckless endangerment rather than heroism. Mr. Ryder rode into a wildfire without proper authorization or coordination with emergency services, Morrison said smoothly. He put lives at risk through actions that appeared heroic, but were actually dangerously impulsive. This demonstrates the poor judgment we're concerned about. Evelyn watched Caleb's face throughout the testimony. Watched him write notes he couldn't present because he had no lawyer to speak for him. Watched him struggle with a system designed for people who could argue verbally, debate in real time, defend themselves through speech. After an hour, Morrison concluded, Your Honor, we're simply asking that Mr. Ryder be provided with proper oversight to ensure his safety and the safety of others. A guardian to manage his affairs would protect everyone involved. Judge Whitlock looked at Caleb. Mr. Ryder, you have the right to present a defense. I understand you're representing yourself. Would you like to call witnesses? Caleb stood, pulled out his notepad and wrote, Yes. I call Sullivan, Tom Parker, and the other men from the fire rescue. The judge allowed it. Sullivan took the stand first and laid out the truth, how Clayton had abandoned them, how Caleb had risked everything to save them, how his navigation through the fire had shown remarkable skill and judgment. Tom Parker testified next, backing up Sullivan's account and adding details about Caleb's ranch management abilities. He's the most organized rancher I know, Your Honor. His books are immaculate. His cattle are healthy. His land is well maintained. The man's deafness hasn't hurt his operation. If anything, it's made him more careful and thorough than most hearing ranchers. But Morrison tore into both of them on cross-examination, suggesting their gratitude was clouding their judgment, implying they didn't understand the legal complexities involved. Judge Whitlock listened patiently, taking notes, his expression unreadable. After 2 hours, it became clear that Caleb's side was losing ground. Testimony from grateful workers couldn't overcome medical experts and legal arguments about capacity and liability. The system was grinding him down exactly as Clayton had planned. Then Evelyn stood up. Your Honor, Ruth called out from the back row, Miss Whitmore has something to say. The judge looked confused. Miss Whitmore isn't on the witness list. She's got information relevant to this case, Ruth insisted. And unless you want this hearing appealed on grounds of suppressing evidence, you'll let her speak. Morrison objected immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. So is using territorial law to settle personal vendettas, Ruth shot back. Judge Whitlock sighed. Miss Whitmore, approach the bench. Evelyn walked forward, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it. She held the document she'd written, her hands sweating despite the cool morning air coming through the windows. The judge looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Miss Whitmore, I understand you have difficulty speaking. If you'd like to submit written testimony, I can review it." Evelyn shook her head, pulled out her notepad and wrote, "I need to speak, out loud. Everyone needs to hear this." "That's not necessary." She wrote, "It is, please." Judge Whitlock studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, the court will hear your statement." Evelyn turned to face the packed courtroom, saw Caleb staring at her with confusion and worry, saw Clayton's smug expression starting to shift toward concern, saw Ruth give her an encouraging nod. She opened her mouth and forced words out through her damaged vocal cords. "My name is Evelyn Whitmore." Her voice was barely above a whisper, raspy and strained, but in the silent courtroom everyone could hear it. 6 months ago, Clayton Mercer brought me here to marry him. He rejected me at the train station because my voice was damaged by illness, called me broken goods in front of everyone. The courtroom was dead silent now, every eye on her. Since then, he's made it his mission to punish me for existing. And when Caleb Ryder treated me with basic human decency, Clayton decided to destroy him too. Her throat burned with every word, but she pushed through. "This hearing isn't about competency. It's about a powerful man who can't stand being challenged by people he considers beneath him." Morrison stood. "Your Honor, this is character assassination." "Sit down," Judge Whitlock said flatly. "I want to hear this." Evelyn continued, her voice getting rougher, but also louder, as if something that had been trapped inside her for months was finally breaking free. "Caleb Ryder runs one of the most successful ranches in this territory. He's done it for 15 years without supervision. He saved 6 men from a wildfire while Clayton abandoned them. He's never had an accident, never lost a major investment, never failed to meet his obligations." She turned to look directly at Clayton, whose face had gone dark red. "But he's deaf, and in Clayton Mercer's world, being different is the same as being defective. So he's using the law as a weapon to take everything Caleb has built, not because Caleb is incompetent, but because Caleb had the audacity to survive and succeed despite Clayton's attempts to destroy him." Her voice cracked, failing completely for a moment. She coughed, pushed harder. "I can't speak properly. Caleb can't hear. But we communicate better than most speaking people ever will. We understand each other. We've built something real despite this town trying to tear us apart. And if you let Clayton take Caleb's ranch through this sham hearing, you're telling everyone in this territory that being different means you don't deserve rights, that power and money matter more than truth." She had to stop, her throat closing up, tears running down her face from the pain of speaking so much. She pulled out the document she'd written and set it on the judge's bench. "Everything I've said is documented here, with witness names, dates, evidence. This isn't opinion, it's fact." Then she turned and walked back to her seat beside Ruth, shaking so hard she could barely stand. The courtroom erupted. People started talking over each other. Morrison was shouting objections. Clayton was on his feet, his face twisted with rage. Sullivan and the other rescued workers were calling out support. Judge Whitlock slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order! In this court!" It took 5 minutes to restore silence. When everyone finally settled, the judge looked at the document Evelyn had left on his bench. He read it slowly, his expression getting grimmer with each page. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Morrison, does your client wish to address these allegations?" Clayton stood, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, Miss Whitmore is emotionally unstable. Her accusations are baseless." "Are they?" The judge's voice was ice. "Because according to this document, there are multiple witnesses who can testify that you've systematically tried to economically isolate Mr. Ryder, that you've spread false information about his capabilities, that you abandoned employees during the fire while Mr. Ryder risked his life to save them." He looked at Clayton over his reading glasses. "This hearing is supposedly about Mr. Ryder's competency, but what I'm seeing suggests it's about your vindictiveness." Morrison tried to intervene. "Your Honor, even if there's personal animosity, that doesn't change the medical facts about Mr. Ryder's condition. His condition," Judge Whitlock cut him off. "His condition is that he's deaf, not brain damaged, not mentally incompetent, just deaf. And according to every piece of evidence presented here today, except the testimony you've paid for, he's managed his affairs perfectly well for a decade and a half." He flipped through Evelyn's document again. It seems to me that the only person whose judgment is questionable here is the petitioner who filed this frivolous case. He looked at Clayton. Mr. Mercer, did you file this petition? Clayton's lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, the petitioner's identity is confidential. Not anymore. Judge Whitlock's expression was thunderous. This court doesn't appreciate being used as a weapon in personal disputes. Mr. Mercer, I'm asking you directly. Did you file this petition? Clayton hesitated, then straightened his shoulders, defiant. Yes, because someone needed to. Ryder is a danger to himself and others. If this court can't see that, This court sees a successful rancher who's being harassed by a man with too much money and not enough character. Judge Whitlock shuffled the papers together. Petition denied. Mr. Ryder's competency is established. This hearing is closed. The courtroom exploded again, but this time with cheering from the back rows. Sullivan and Tom Parker were slapping each other on the back. Workers were grinning. Even some of the townspeople who'd been neutral were nodding approval. Caleb sat at the defense table looking stunned, like he couldn't quite process what had happened. Clayton stood frozen, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. He looked at Evelyn with pure hatred. You'll regret this, he said, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. Both of you. Judge Whitlock's gavel came down hard. Mr. Mercer, any further threats, and I'll hold you in contempt. Get out of my courtroom. Clayton left, Morrison scrambling after him, the two of them pushing through the crowd toward the exit. Evelyn sat in her chair, shaking, her throat screaming in pain, tears still running down her face. She'd done it. She'd actually spoken. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but enough. Enough to be heard. Ruth grabbed her shoulder. You magnificent, crazy woman. You just humiliated the most powerful man in the territory. Caleb appeared beside her, his notepad already out. What you did? His handwriting stopped. He looked at her, and she saw tears in his eyes, too. He reached for her hand and held it tight. No words, no notes, just contact. Sometimes that was enough. They left the courthouse through a crowd that parted like water, people reaching out to shake Caleb's hand or pat Evelyn's shoulder as they passed. Sullivan caught up with them on the steps outside, grinning wider than Evelyn had ever seen a man grin. That was the damnedest thing I've ever witnessed, he said, then remembered Caleb couldn't hear him, and grabbed the notepad from Caleb's pocket. Wrote, You two just destroyed Clayton Mercer in front of the whole territory. Caleb took the pad back. Evelyn destroyed him. I just sat there. You survived. That's what mattered. Tom Parker joined them, along with 3 other ranchers Evelyn recognized from town, but had never spoken to. One of them, a grizzled man named Porter who ran cattle north of the Blackstone Hills, stuck out his hand to Caleb. Been meaning to tell you, Porter said slowly, enunciating clearly so Caleb could read his lips. You did right by those boys in the fire. Real right. If you need hands for fall roundup, I got 2 sons looking for work. They're good boys. I'll make sure they treat you fair. Caleb shook his hand, looking overwhelmed. Another rancher stepped forward. Morrison's General Store might have cut you off, but I got connections with suppliers in Cheyenne. Better prices anyway. You need feed or equipment? I'll put in a word. One by one, people who'd ignored or avoided Caleb for years suddenly wanted to help. Wanted to be associated with the man who'd beaten Clayton Mercer. Evelyn watched it happen with mixed feelings. Grateful for the support, but cynical about how quickly people switched sides when the power dynamics shifted. Ruth appeared at her elbow. Come on, your throat sounds like you swallowed broken glass. Let's get you home before you do permanent damage showing off. Back at the boarding house, Ruth made Evelyn drink hot water with honey and refused to let her speak for the rest of the day. Caleb stayed, sitting at the common room table with his notepad, not writing much, just existing in the same space as her like he needed to confirm she was real and what had happened actually occurred. Around sunset, he finally wrote, You didn't have to do that. Evelyn took the pencil. Yes, I did. You hate speaking in front of people. I know you do. Your hands shake for an hour before you try to say anything to strangers. I was terrified. Then why? She thought about how to answer that, finally wrote, Because some things matter more than fear, and you matter more than my comfort. He stared at the notepad for a long time, then wrote something and pushed it across to her. Marry me. Evelyn's heart stopped. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. Looked up at him. His face was serious, nervous, determined all at once. She wrote, "That's not a proper proposal. I don't know how to do proper. I'm a deaf rancher who lives alone and doesn't know how to talk to people, but I know I don't want to spend another day without you. So, marry me. People will talk. They already talk. Let them. We've known each other 6 months. I knew after 3 weeks. Just took me this long to get the courage to ask." Evelyn felt tears threatening again, which was ridiculous because she'd already cried more today than she had in the previous year combined. She picked up the pencil, her hand shaking slightly, and wrote one word. Yes. Caleb's face transformed. Not quite a smile. He still wasn't much for smiling, but something close. Relief and joy and disbelief all mixed together. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, holding on like she might disappear if he let go. Ruth walked in carrying more hot water, saw them sitting there holding hands across the notepad with "Marry me" and "Yes" written on it, and said, "Well, about damn time. Thought you two were going to dance around each other until winter." They were married 3 weeks later on a Saturday afternoon at the ranch, with the Blackstone Hills rising in the distance and the whole sky turning gold as the sun dropped west. No church, no fancy ceremony, just Judge Whitlock performing a simple civil service while a small group watched. Sullivan and the other rescued workers came. Tom Parker and his wife. Porter and his family. Han closed the tailor shop for the day and made the journey north. Ruth stood beside Evelyn, performing some unofficial role between witness and guardian, smoking a cigarette and looking vaguely emotional in a way she'd probably deny later. The ceremony itself was brief and unconventional. Judge Whitlock spoke the traditional words, then paused and signed the important parts for Caleb while speaking them aloud for Evelyn. When it came time for vows, Evelyn managed to whisper, "I do," clearly enough for everyone to hear, and Caleb signed his agreement while Whitlock spoke the words for him. They exchanged simple gold bands. Caleb had ordered them from a jeweler in Cheyenne, and they fit perfectly even though Evelyn hadn't been there for sizing. He'd measured her finger one Sunday afternoon while she was sleeping, she realized, had been planning this even before the courthouse hearing. When Whitlock pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her carefully, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. The assembled witnesses clapped. Sullivan whistled. Ruth wiped at her eyes and claimed it was just dust. The celebration afterward was nothing fancy. Someone had brought whiskey. Ruth had contributed a cake she'd somehow managed to bake without the boarding house kitchen burning down. People ate and drank and talked while the evening light faded to purple and then black. Porter cornered Caleb at one point, and Evelyn watched them communicate through a combination of exaggerated gestures, lip reading, and Tom Parker translating. Porter was explaining something about water rights and shared grazing areas, treating Caleb like a legitimate business partner instead of someone to be managed or pitied. Han found Evelyn standing alone by the porch, watching the gathering. He offered her a cup of whiskey, which she declined, and then wrote on a scrap of paper, "You've built something good here. Don't let anyone take it from you." She wrote back, "Thank you for everything. For giving me work when nobody else would. You earned that work. I just provided the opportunity." He paused, then added, "I'm closing the shop next month, moving to California to live with my daughter. Been planning it for a year, but I wanted to wait until I knew you'd be all right." Evelyn felt a rush of panic. "What will I do?" "You'll figure it out. You've got a mind for business and skills people need. Maybe start your own shop, or teach, or find some other way to make yourself necessary." He smiled slightly. "That's what we do, people like us. We make ourselves so necessary they can't ignore us anymore." By 10 o'clock, most people had left. Ruth had claimed one of the spare rooms Caleb kept for occasional hired hands, refusing to ride back to town in the dark. The ranch settled into quiet, just night sounds and wind moving through grass. Evelyn and Caleb stood on the porch, looking out at the dark landscape. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, both of them tired and content and slightly overwhelmed by how drastically their lives had changed in the span of a few hours. He pulled out a notepad, always the notepad, their constant companion, and wrote, "Scared?" "Terrified," she wrote back honestly. "You?" "Same, but also happy. Didn't think I'd ever feel this. Didn't think anyone would want this with me. I want everything with you, even the parts that scare me." They went inside eventually, to the small bedroom at the back of the house that would now belong to both of them. It was awkward at first, the self-consciousness of two people who'd never been physically intimate navigating new territory. But they'd learned to communicate without words months ago, and that skill translated here too. Patience and attention, and the kind of trust that came from two people who'd already survived the worst together. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Caleb's steady breathing beside her, Evelyn thought about the train station 6 months ago. Thought about Clayton's rejection and how it had felt like the end of everything. How she'd believed losing her voice meant losing any chance at a real life. She'd been wrong about almost everything. The morning after the wedding, Evelyn woke to find Caleb already gone. She dressed and went outside, found him in the barn tending to the horses with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything he did. He saw her, smiled slightly, came over and kissed her forehead. They had coffee and breakfast, communicating through the comfortable silence that had become their native language. Then Caleb showed her the ranch books, detailed ledgers tracking income, expenses, cattle inventory, equipment maintenance, everything. He wrote, "This is ours now, both of us. I want you to understand how everything works. You trust me with this? I trust you with everything." They spent the morning going through the business operations. Evelyn had learned a lot over the past months, but this was different. This was Caleb opening up every aspect of his operation, showing her the vulnerabilities and strengths, the tight margins and risky decisions that kept a frontier ranch running. "You're barely breaking even some months," she said aloud, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't hear her, then wrote it down. "These margins are thin, always have been. Ranching is gambling against weather, markets, disease, accidents. Some years we do well. Some years we survive. That's frontier life. We could do better. How?" Evelyn studied the books, thinking about the economics she'd learned watching her father run his business in Philadelphia before he died. Thinking about supply chains and market timing and negotiation leverage, she wrote, "You're selling cattle at the wrong time. Everyone sells in fall after Roundup. Prices drop because of oversupply. What if we held some stock through winter and sold in late spring when prices are higher? Winter feeding is expensive, but if spring prices are 40% higher, we could feed half the herd through winter, sell them in April, and make more profit than selling everything in October." Caleb studied her notes, his expression thoughtful. "That's risky. What if they die over winter? What if spring prices don't rise? Everything is risky. This is just calculated risk instead of accepting what everyone else accepts." He looked at her for a long moment, then wrote, "You're right. Let's try it with 20% of the herd this year. Test the theory." They worked through other ideas. Crop rotation in the garden to improve soil, expanding the ranch's water storage, building relationships with different suppliers to reduce dependence on dry hollow businesses. Small improvements that wouldn't revolutionize anything overnight but might add up to stability over years. Around noon, Sullivan rode up with 2 of the other rescued workers. They'd come to help with fence repairs, they explained through written notes. Wouldn't accept payment. Just wanted to contribute because they owed Caleb their lives, and this was the only way they knew to balance that debt. Caleb tried to refuse. They insisted. Eventually he accepted because turning down help when you needed it was prideful stupidity on the frontier. The afternoon passed in physical work. Evelyn helped where she could, holding posts steady, sorting tools, bringing water and food to the men working in the sun. She was still figuring out her place in the ranch's operation, learning through observation and mistakes. By sunset, a section of fence that had needed repair for 2 months was finished. Sullivan and his friends left with promises to return the following week. Caleb and Evelyn ate dinner on the porch, too tired to do much more than sit and watch the light fade. He wrote, "This could work. What could? This, us. Building something real here. I was so used to doing everything alone that I forgot what partnership could look like. We're figuring it out," she wrote back. "Neither of us knows what we're doing. Nobody does. Everyone's just pretending." That made her smile, which made him smile, which led to them just sitting there grinning at each other like idiots until the mosquitoes drove them inside. The following weeks established their rhythm. Caleb handled the physical ranch work, cattle management, equipment repair, the endless manual labor that kept everything running. Evelyn took over the business side, correspondence with buyers, inventory tracking, negotiating with suppliers, managing accounts. She also started teaching. It began accidentally when Porter's youngest daughter came to the ranch one afternoon with her father. The girl, maybe 9 years old, had damaged her hearing from a childhood illness, Not completely deaf, but struggling in school because she missed half of what teachers said. Porter explained the situation apologetically. School teacher says she's slow, but I don't think that's it. I think she just can't hear well enough to keep up. Evelyn looked at the girl, saw herself and Caleb reflected in those frustrated eyes. Wrote a note. I can teach her. You? Porter looked skeptical. No offense, ma'am, but you can't speak proper either. How would you? She interrupted by pulling out 2 notepads, handing one to the girl, and starting a written conversation. Within 10 minutes, she'd assessed that the child was smart, bored, and desperate to learn, but completely lost in a classroom built for hearing students. I'll teach her twice a week, Evelyn wrote to Porter. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Things she can learn through written instruction instead of verbal lecture. I can't pay much. I don't want payment. I want her to have a chance. Porter agreed, looking relieved and skeptical in equal measure. The following Tuesday, his daughter arrived for her first lesson. Evelyn set up a space in the ranch house's spare room and discovered she was a natural teacher, patient where others rushed, creative in finding ways to explain concepts visually or through written examples. Word spread. Within a month, 2 more children were coming to the ranch for lessons. One boy who was deaf, like Caleb, another girl who was painfully shy and hadn't spoken in school for 3 years despite having a working voice. Evelyn charged modest fees that barely covered supplies, but built something more valuable than money. A reputation as someone who could help kids the regular school system had given up on. The teaching brought unexpected benefits. Parents who'd been neutral about Caleb suddenly supported him because their children were thriving under Evelyn's instruction. The ranch became a gathering point for families who'd previously had no reason to travel that far north. And Evelyn discovered that teaching gave her something she hadn't realized she'd needed: purpose beyond survival. She wasn't just existing anymore. She was contributing, building, creating value in a world that had told her she had nothing to offer. Clayton, meanwhile, had disappeared from public life. After the courthouse humiliation, he'd retreated to his ranch and stopped coming to town. His business interests began to collapse as partners distanced themselves and workers quit for better opportunities. Morrison's General Store reversed its policy and started extending Caleb credit again, the owner explaining awkwardly that circumstances had changed. Ruth reported that Clayton had started drinking heavily, that his ranch was falling into disrepair, that he'd fired most of his staff and was running operations with a skeleton crew who stayed mostly because they had nowhere else to go. "Man's having a breakdown," Ruth said one evening when she visited the ranch for dinner. "Not that I'm complaining. He earned every bit of misery he's experiencing, but I'd keep an eye out anyway. Desperate men do stupid things." Caleb wrote, "You think he'll try something? I think he's the kind of person who can't accept losing. And he lost big, to people he considered beneath him. That kind of wound doesn't heal. It festers." Evelyn felt unease settle in her stomach. She'd been so focused on building their new life that she'd almost forgotten Clayton existed. But Ruth was right. Men like Clayton didn't just accept defeat. They waited, planned, found new angles of attack. She wrote, "What should we do? Stay alert. Keep friends close. Make sure people know where you are and what you're doing. Harder to hurt someone when they're connected to a community that gives a damn about them." Fall arrived with frost in the mornings and cattle getting fat on the last of the good grass. Caleb started preparations for roundup, sorting cattle, identifying which animals to sell, and which to keep through winter. He decided to follow Evelyn's suggestion about holding stock for spring sale, selecting the healthiest 20% of the herd and calculating winter feed requirements. Sullivan and Tom Parker helped with the roundup, along with Porter's 2 sons and 3 other workers who'd heard Caleb paid fair and treated people decent. For 2 weeks, the ranch was full of activity, men working cattle during the day, playing cards and telling stories in the evening, sleeping in the barn or under wagons depending on weather. Evelyn cooked for the crew, which tested abilities she'd never fully developed. Ranch cooking wasn't like Philadelphia cooking. It was quantity over quality, calories over presentation, whatever could be made in large batches and wouldn't kill anyone. She burned beans, oversalted stew, produced biscuits that could double as weapons. The men ate it anyway and thanked her politely, though she caught them supplementing with jerky and hardtack when they thought she wasn't looking. Sullivan wrote one evening, "No offense, but you're a terrible cook." She wrote back, "None taken. I know. Want some help? My ma taught me before she died. I could show you some tricks." They spent the next evening with Sullivan teaching her basic ranch cooking, how to manage a Dutch oven, how to season properly, how to make bread that didn't taste like saddle leather. He was patient and funny, and by the end of the week, Evelyn's cooking had improved from barely edible to actually decent. The roundup ended successfully. Caleb sold 80% of his cattle at market prices that were lower than hoped but acceptable. The remaining 20%, 48 head, would winter at the ranch, fed on hay Caleb had stockpiled and supplemented with grain purchased through Porter's Cheyenne connections. If Evelyn's theory was right, they'd sell those cattle in April for enough profit to cover winter expenses and still come out ahead. If she was wrong, they'd lose money and look foolish. "No pressure," Ruth said when she heard about the plan. "Just your entire winter food budget riding on whether cattle prices rise in spring." "Thanks for that," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. "Very comforting. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to keep you realistic." Ruth lit a cigarette, studying the ranch with appraising eyes. "Though, I'll admit, you two have built something impressive here. 6 months ago, you were a scared woman with no prospects, and he was a lonely rancher everyone ignored. Now look at you. Teaching kids, running a successful operation, making other ranchers respect you. It's almost disgustingly inspirational." Evelyn smiled. Coming from Ruth, that was high praise. Winter arrived early and hard. Snow fell in November and didn't stop. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. The wind never ceased, turning every trip outside into a battle against elements that wanted to kill you. The ranch became isolated. Travel to town was difficult and dangerous. They went weeks between visits, relying on stored supplies and their own resources. The children who'd been coming for lessons stopped. Their parents weren't risking frozen roads for education that could wait until spring. It was just Caleb and Evelyn, alone together with 48 cattle and the endless Wyoming winter pressing down on everything. Some days were hard. The isolation wore on them both. The constant cold was exhausting. The worry about whether the cattle would survive, whether the hay would last, whether they'd made a terrible mistake with the spring sale plan, all of it built up like snow on a roof waiting to collapse. They had their first real fight in late December. Caleb had gone out to check the cattle during a blizzard despite Evelyn's written objections. He'd been gone for 3 hours. 3 hours while she paced the house, watching the window, imagining him frozen to death in a drift somewhere. When he finally came back, frost covering his coat and hat, she'd been so angry she'd thrown her notepad at him. He'd stared at her in confusion, not understanding what he'd done wrong. She'd grabbed another notepad and wrote with shaking hands, "You could have died. In that storm. I wouldn't have even known where to look for you, and you just left without telling me how long you'd be gone or which pasture you were checking." He wrote back, "The cattle needed to be checked. The storm was getting worse. The cattle aren't worth your life. They're our investment, our future. I can't just ignore them. And I can't just lose you. Not after everything. You don't get to be careless with your life when someone else depends on you now." That had stopped him. He'd stood there in the doorway, melting snow pooling around his boots, and finally understood what she was actually saying. He wrote, "I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking about how it would feel for you, about waiting and not knowing. Promise me you'll tell me before you go out in bad weather. Tell me where and how long. So I know. I promise." They'd held each other for a long time, both of them shaking slightly, both realizing that partnership meant considering another person's fear alongside your own priorities. After that, they developed systems. Before Caleb went out in bad weather, he'd leave a written note explaining where he was going and when he expected to return. If he didn't return within an hour of that time, Evelyn would ring the bell mounted on the porch, loud enough that he could see it even if he couldn't hear it, the vibrations carrying across the ranch. It wasn't perfect, but it was something they'd built together, a small structure of communication and care in the middle of a landscape that didn't care whether they lived or died. Christmas came and went quietly. They exchanged simple gifts. Evelyn gave Caleb a new set of quality pencils for his notepads. He gave her a warm coat he'd ordered from a catalog months earlier, sized perfectly. They cooked a better-than-average meal and sat by the fire, reading books they'd borrowed from town before the snow got too deep. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. January brought the coldest temperatures yet. The cattle struggled despite the feed supplements. 3 died despite their best efforts, 2 from cold stress, 1 from an injury that became infected. Each death felt like a personal failure, like they'd somehow not done enough. But 45 survived, which was better than many ranchers managed that winter. By February, Evelyn's teaching money had run out. They were living on credit and stored supplies, burning through resources faster than she'd calculated. The spring sale had to work. If it didn't, they'd be in serious financial trouble. The isolation was getting to both of them. Cabin fever set in. Small annoyances became larger arguments. The notepad conversations got shorter, more clipped, both of them too tired and stressed to put effort into communication. One evening, Evelyn was cooking dinner while Caleb was outside doing evening chores. She was thinking about nothing in particular, just stirring stew and watching snow fall outside the window, when she heard something that made her freeze. A horse. Multiple horses. Approaching from the east. Nobody traveled in this weather unless they had to, and nobody visited the Ryder Ranch without advance notice. She grabbed the revolver Ruth had given her months ago, kept loaded now, kept close, went to the door and looked out through the small window. 3 men on horseback, bundled against the cold. She didn't recognize them. They stopped at the barn where Caleb was working, dismounted, went inside. Evelyn's heart hammered. She couldn't hear what was happening. Couldn't tell if Caleb was in danger or if this was legitimate business or something worse. She pulled on her coat, checked the revolver, and headed for the barn. By the time she reached it, the 3 men were leaving, mounting their horses and riding back toward town through the snow. Caleb stood in the barn doorway, watching them go, his expression dark and troubled. She touched his arm. He turned, saw her, saw the gun in her hand. He pulled out his notepad, wrote, "Clayton selling his ranch." Those were his representatives. They wanted to buy my cattle. Why? Because he needs to liquidate fast. He's broke. Everything collapsed. They offered good money, above market rate. You said no? Of course I said no. But Evelyn, his handwriting got messier. He's ruined, completely ruined, and he blames us. So? So men who've lost everything are dangerous. Ruth was right. We need to be careful. They went back to the house, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. That Clayton's visit, even through representatives, was a warning of something worse ahead. She was right. 3 nights after Clayton's representatives visited, the barn caught fire. Evelyn woke to Judge stamping and screaming in his stall, the sound penetrating through the walls and the wind. She grabbed Caleb's shoulder, shaking him hard, pointing toward the window where orange light flickered against the snow. They ran outside in their nightclothes, boots barely laced, into cold so sharp it felt like knives. The barn's west side was already engulfed, flames spreading fast despite the snow everywhere. The horses were trapped inside, along with 45 cattle they'd fought all winter to keep alive. Caleb ran straight for the barn doors. Evelyn followed, her mind screaming that this wasn't an accident, that the fire had started too fast, too deliberately. But there was no time to process that now. Only time to save what they could. The heat hit them like a physical wall when Caleb wrenched the doors open. Judge bolted past them immediately, followed by the 2 other horses, wild-eyed and panicked. The cattle were harder, confused, frightened, reluctant to move toward the flames they could see even if they didn't understand. Caleb went in despite the smoke pouring out. Evelyn grabbed a length of rope from the porch, followed him into hell. The smoke was the worst part. Thick and black and choking, worse than the wildfire because it was enclosed, concentrated. Evelyn couldn't see 3 feet ahead, couldn't breathe without coughing. She kept low, one hand on the wall, trying to reach the cattle stalls. She found Caleb by running into him in the smoke. He was opening stall gates, slapping cattle to drive them toward the door. The animals moved reluctantly, bellowing in fear. Evelyn grabbed a stick from somewhere, used it to herd them forward. They got maybe 20 head out before part of the roof collapsed. The sound was enormous, timber cracking, metal shrieking, hay burning like it was soaked in kerosene. Caleb couldn't hear it, but he felt it, the vibration through the floor, and grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulled her back toward the door. She resisted. There were still cattle inside, still animals trapped in stalls they hadn't reached. Caleb pulled harder, his face set in the expression she'd learned meant he wasn't negotiating. They stumbled out into the snow together just as another section of roof came down where they'd been standing 5 seconds earlier. They stood there gasping, covered in soot and ash, watching the barn burn. The cattle they'd saved milled around in the snow, confused and scared. The ones still inside were screaming. Evelyn counted. 23. They'd saved 23 out of 45. 22 were going to burn to death. She started toward the barn again. Caleb caught her, held her back. She fought him, stronger than she'd known she could be, trying to break free. He held on, and she saw tears on his face, cutting tracks through the soot. He knew they couldn't save the rest. Knew going back in meant dying. But knowing didn't make it easier to stand there and listen to animals burn. The barn collapsed completely around 3 in the morning. By then, neighbors had arrived, Porter and Sullivan and Tom Parker, alerted by the glow visible for miles. They'd brought equipment to fight the fire, but there was nothing left to save. Just embers and ash and the smell of burned flesh. Porter found Caleb sitting in the snow, staring at the ruins. He knelt beside him, waited until Caleb looked at him, then signed something. Evelyn didn't know sign language beyond the basics, but she understood the meaning. Porter was asking if they were okay. Caleb signed back. Porter's face went dark. He stood, walked over to where Sullivan was checking the surviving cattle, spoke to him in low tones. Sullivan's expression turned murderous. He came to Evelyn, wrote on his notepad, "Caleb says this wasn't an accident. Says he smelled kerosene when he first opened the doors." Evelyn nodded. She'd smelled it too. "Clayton? Who else?" Sullivan looked at the burned barn, jaw tight. "That son of a bitch. He burned your stock because you wouldn't sell to him." Tom Parker joined them, read the notepad over Sullivan's shoulder. "We need to tell the sheriff. This is arson. This is..." "It's nothing we can prove," Sullivan said flatly. "You think Clayton did this himself? He hired someone. Someone with no connection to him on paper. Someone who'll swear they were somewhere else." He looked at Evelyn. "This is how men like him work. They destroy you and never leave fingerprints." The neighbors stayed until dawn, helping move the surviving cattle to a temporary corral built from salvaged fencing, making sure the fire was completely out, checking that the house hadn't caught. Then they left with promises to return, to help rebuild, to bring supplies. Caleb and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table as sunrise turned the sky gray. Neither had washed yet. They were both still covered in ash and soot and the smell of burned things. Caleb wrote, "We're ruined." "No. Evelyn, we lost half the cattle. All the equipment, all the hay, the barn itself. That's thousands of dollars in losses. And spring sale won't cover it now because we don't have enough stock left. We still have 23 head, and we have each other. That's not enough to run a ranch." Evelyn stared at the notepad, at his defeated handwriting, and felt something shift inside her, something that had been building since the train station, since Clayton's rejection, since every moment of being told she was broken and useless and had nothing to offer. She was done being quiet about it. She grabbed the pencil, wrote with enough force to tear the paper. "Clayton wants us to give up." That's what this was about. Destroy our stock, destroy our hope, make us sell to him for nothing and disappear. That's what he wants. So we don't give him what he wants. We rebuild. We survive. We prove that burning our barn doesn't burn us out. How? With what money? I don't know yet. But we figure it out. Together. Caleb looked at her for a long time, then wrote, "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most stubborn. Both. Now get cleaned up. We have work to do." The next morning, they rode to town together. Evelyn's throat was raw from smoke inhalation. Caleb's hands were blistered from fighting the fire, but neither was willing to wait. They needed to report the arson, needed to make people understand what had happened. Sheriff Dawson listened to their written account, his face grave. "I believe you," he said carefully. "But believing isn't proving. You got any evidence Clayton was involved?" Evelyn wrote, "Who else would do this?" Personal conviction isn't evidence in court. You need witnesses, physical proof, something connecting him to the fire. "So he just gets away with it?" Dawson sighed. "Unless you can prove he paid someone to do it, yes. And men like Clayton use intermediaries for exactly this reason. Plausible deniability." He leaned forward. "Look, between you and me, everyone knows Clayton's behind this. But knowing and proving are different things. My hands are tied." They left the sheriff's office with nothing accomplished. Evelyn felt rage building in her chest, hot and choking like the smoke from last night. Clayton had destroyed 22 cattle, thousands of dollars in property, and he was going to face no consequences because he was rich enough to hire criminals and smart enough not to leave evidence. The injustice of it made her want to scream. Ruth found them at the boarding house an hour later. She'd heard about the fire, came prepared with food and practical supplies, and her usual blunt assessment of reality. "This is bad," she said after reading their account. "Worse than the first attacks because this hit you financially. Clayton knows you can't recover from this easily." She lit a cigarette, thinking. "He's trying to force you to sell. Probably figures you'll come to him desperate, accept whatever price he offers, and then he gets your land for cheap and you disappear from the territory." Evelyn wrote, "We're not selling. Then you need money, fast, enough to rebuild, restock, survive until you can get back to profitable operation." Ruth did calculations in her head. "That's at least $2,000, probably more. You got that kind of cash lying around?" Caleb shook his head. "Then you need to find it. Bank loan, investors, wealthy patrons, something. Because pride doesn't feed cattle through winter." They spent 2 days trying to secure loans. Every bank in Dry Hollow refused them. Too risky, they said. Too much uncertainty. Too much debt already from winter feeding costs. The bank in Cheyenne wouldn't even see them without a reference from a local bank, which they couldn't get. Investors weren't interested in a ranch that had just lost half its stock to arson. Wealthy ranchers expressed sympathy, but no actual financial support. By the third day, Evelyn was starting to believe Caleb had been right. They were ruined. All their work, all their survival, all their defiance of Clayton's attempts to destroy them, none of it mattered if they couldn't pay for basic operations. Then Porter showed up at the ranch with an envelope. Caleb opened it to find $500 in cash and a note. "From ranchers who remember what you did during the fire. It's not charity, it's investment. We expect you to succeed and return the favor someday." Over the next week, more envelopes arrived. Sullivan brought $300 collected from the rescued workers and their families. Tom Parker contributed $200 of his own money. Han sent $150 from California, having heard about the fire through correspondence with someone in Dry Hollow. Even some of the families whose children Evelyn had taught sent small amounts, $5 here, $10 there, whatever they could afford. By the end of the month, they had $1,800. Not enough to fully rebuild, but enough to buy basic supplies, purchase a few replacement cattle, rent temporary barn space from Porter while they constructed a new building. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by envelopes and written notes of support, many from people she'd never formally met, and understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. They'd built community without realizing it. Every person they'd helped, every connection they'd made, every moment of treating others with basic human decency had created a network that caught them when Clayton tried to destroy them. That network was stronger than one wealthy man's hatred. She showed the pile of donations to Caleb. He stared at it for a long time, then wrote, "Why are people doing this? Because they remember what we did for them, and because they're tired of Clayton winning. This doesn't solve everything. We're still barely surviving, but we are surviving. That's what matters." Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting in patches, revealing the brown grass underneath and the destruction the fire had left behind. The barn was nothing but a burned foundation and ash. But Sullivan and Porter and a crew of volunteers showed up in early April with lumber and tools and sweat equity. They worked for 2 weeks rebuilding, not a barn as large as the original. They couldn't afford that, but something functional, something that would shelter cattle and horses and equipment through the next winter. Evelyn helped where she could, though construction wasn't her strength. She mostly provided food for the workers and managed the business logistics of purchasing supplies and tracking expenses. On the side, she'd started something new. She'd written to the Territorial Education Office proposing a formal school for children with disabilities. Not just reading and writing, but comprehensive education designed around different learning needs. The letter was 12 pages long, meticulously researched, professionally formatted. She'd spent weeks on it, using every bit of education and business training she'd absorbed in Philadelphia. The response came in late April. Conditional approval pending funding and certification. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was possibility. She showed the letter to Caleb. He read it, then looked at her with something approaching awe. Wrote, "You're going to build a school. Maybe. If we can find funding, you'll find it. You're too stubborn to fail." I learned from the best. The spring cattle sale happened in mid-May. Prices had risen exactly as Evelyn predicted. 40% higher than fall rates due to limited supply and high demand. The 23 surviving cattle sold for enough profit to cover their winter losses and provide working capital for the next year. It wasn't a fortune, but it was survival with a margin for hope. Clayton's ranch sold at auction a week later for a fraction of what it had been worth. He'd left the territory entirely, moved back east somewhere. His empire completely collapsed. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in his ruin, just relief that he was gone and could hurt no one else. Judge Whitlock bought the former Mercer property, divided it into smaller parcels, and sold them to younger ranchers just starting out. The land that had represented Clayton's dominance became opportunities for people he'd once looked down on. There was poetry in that, Evelyn thought, quiet justice. Summer brought her students back. The families who'd sent children for lessons before now brought more. Siblings, cousins, neighbor kids who'd heard about the woman who taught differently. Evelyn found herself managing 8 students by June, 10 by July. The Territorial Education Office sent an inspector in August, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, who spent 3 days observing Evelyn's teaching methods, interviewing students and parents, reviewing curricula. At the end of the visit, Mrs. Patterson sat across from Evelyn at the ranch house table and said, "Your methods are unconventional." Evelyn braced for rejection, wrote, "But effective?" "Very effective. The children you've worked with show comprehension levels above their grade expectations. The boy who was failing reading in regular school is now reading at an advanced level. The girl who hadn't spoken in years is communicating confidently through writing." Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses. "I'm recommending full certification for your school, and I'm going to suggest the territory provide a grant to expand your program." Evelyn stared at the notepad, not quite believing what she'd heard. "You've demonstrated that education can adapt to students rather than forcing students to adapt to education," Mrs. Patterson continued. "That's revolutionary, Miss Whitmore. Or should I say Mrs. Ryder?" She smiled slightly. "The territory needs more teachers like you." The grant came through in September, $500 annually to operate a certified school for students with special educational needs. It wasn't wealth, but combined with tuition fees from families who could afford them and Caleb's ranch income, it created stability. They expanded the ranch house, adding 2 rooms specifically for teaching. Evelyn hired an assistant, a young woman from Cheyenne who'd lost her hearing to scarlet fever and desperately wanted meaningful work. Together, they taught 15 students by the end of the year. Caleb's ranch operations stabilized. The new barn was functional, if not fancy. Porter's sons hired on as full-time workers, reliable and hard-working. The experimental spring sales strategy proved successful enough to repeat, creating a business model that other ranchers started copying. People began referring to the Ryder Ranch as innovative, progressive, a model for how frontier operations could adapt and thrive. It was strange, Evelyn thought, how quickly perception could shift. A year ago, they'd been outcasts. Now they were examples. But the real changes were smaller and more personal. Caleb smiled more. Not often, he wasn't built for constant cheerfulness, but regularly enough that Evelyn noticed the difference. He'd relaxed into their partnership, stopped carrying everything alone, learned to accept help without seeing it as weakness. And Evelyn's voice, while still damaged, hurt less than it used to. She could speak for longer periods without pain, could project enough volume for teaching without straining. The physical limitation remained, but she'd stopped seeing it as a prison. Just another aspect of who she was, no more defining than her hair color or height. They held their first formal school graduation in June of the following year. 6 students completed their education programs, reading, writing, arithmetic, practical skills. All of them from families who thought their children would never receive real education. The ceremony was small, held at the ranch with parents and community members attending. Each student received a certificate Evelyn had hand-lettered, along with books donated by families across the territory. Porter's daughter gave a short speech. She'd been the first student, the one Evelyn had taught when she barely knew what she was doing. Now she was reading at a college level and helping teach younger children. "Mrs. Ryder taught me I wasn't broken," the girl said, her voice steady despite damaged hearing that would affect her forever. "She taught me I just learned differently, and that different wasn't wrong, it was just different." Evelyn watched from the side, tears in her eyes, Caleb's hand in hers. This was what they'd built. Not just a ranch or a school, but proof that the world's definitions of valuable and broken and worthy were arbitrary, that people dismissed as defective could build lives of meaning and impact, that silence could become its own form of power. After the ceremony, Ruth pulled Evelyn aside. The boarding house owner was getting older, planning to sell her property and retire. She'd come partly to attend the graduation, partly to say goodbye before moving to live with a sister in Denver. "You did good," Ruth said simply. "Better than good. You took everything this territory tried to use against you and turned it into strength. That's rare." Evelyn wrote, "I couldn't have done it without help. Without you. Sure you could have. Maybe would have taken longer, but you'd have figured it out. You're the stubborn type." Ruth lit her final cigarette in Wyoming territory, looking out over the ranch. "You know what I think? I think the world needs more people who refuse to disappear when they're told to. People who look at society's rules about who matters and who doesn't, and say, that's bullshit. You and Caleb did that, and you made it work. It almost didn't work. We almost lost everything. But you didn't. And that's what people will remember. Not the fire, not Clayton's attacks, not the hardship. They'll remember that two people everyone dismissed built something so solid that it couldn't be destroyed." Ruth stubbed out her cigarette. "That's legacy, girl. Most people never get close to that." Ruth left the next morning. Evelyn watched the wagon disappear toward Dry Hollow and felt the strange emptiness that comes from saying goodbye to someone who'd seen you at your worst and helped you survive it anyway. The years that followed weren't easy. Ranching never was. There were droughts and harsh winters and market fluctuations that threatened everything they'd built. Students came and went. Some succeeded dramatically. Others struggled. The school expanded to 20 students, then contracted to 12 during a bad economic year, then grew again. But they survived. Every challenge, every setback, every moment when giving up would have been easier. They survived it together. Caleb eventually became a territorial advisor on ranch management and disability accommodation. His innovations in cattle breeding and sustainable grazing practices were studied by agricultural programs across the West. Ranchers who'd once mocked him now sought his consultation. Evelyn's school became accredited by the Territorial Education System, then recognized by several Eastern universities as a model program. She trained other teachers in her methods, published articles about adaptive education, spoke at conferences, her damaged voice amplified by her reputation and the undeniable success of her students. They had children eventually, 2 daughters and a son, all born healthy, all growing up fluent in sign language alongside spoken English. The kids learned early that difference was normal in the Ryder household. That communication took many forms, that their father's deafness and mother's scarred voice were just facts, not tragedies. Their oldest daughter became a doctor. The second became a teacher. The son took over the ranch, expanding it beyond what Caleb and Evelyn had built, incorporating new techniques but maintaining the core philosophy: hard work, fair treatment, innovation over tradition. But perhaps the most significant change was in Dry Hollow itself. The town that had once treated Caleb and Evelyn as curiosities and threats gradually transformed. Sign language became common enough that hearing people learned it for practical reasons: communication across distances, working in loud environments, including deaf community members. Businesses adapted. Schools incorporated different teaching methods. The definition of normal expanded to include people who'd previously been pushed to the margins. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear completely. Some people remained stuck in old thinking. But the foundation had shifted. The possibility of different kinds of lives, different kinds of success, different kinds of worth. That possibility had become real in a way it hadn't been before Evelyn stepped off that train. 20 years after the barn fire, Evelyn stood on the same porch where she and Caleb had stood on their wedding day. The ranch had grown. The school occupied its own building now, separate from the house. Cattle grazed across land they'd slowly expanded through careful purchases and partnerships. Caleb joined her, moving a little slower than he used to, but still strong at 55. He handed her a cup of coffee, and they stood together watching the sunset turn the western sky pink and gold. He pulled out a notepad. After all these years, still their primary form of communication. Wrote, "Do you ever regret it? Coming here? Everything that happened?" Evelyn took the pencil, considered the question seriously, thought about Clayton's rejection, the isolation, the poverty, the fire, all the moments when everything could have fallen apart. Finally wrote, no, not even the hard parts, because the hard parts led here. Here isn't perfect. Perfect doesn't exist. But this is real, and ours, and built from choices we made instead of circumstances that happened to us. That's better than perfect. Caleb read it, then reached over and took her hand. They stood like that for a long time, two people who the world had labeled broken and discarded, who'd built a life so full and rich that the labels didn't matter anymore. Because that was the truth. Nobody told you about being different or damaged or dismissed, that survival could become its own rebellion. That building a life in spite of the people who said you couldn't was the deepest form of defiance. That sometimes the loudest statement you could make was simply refusing to disappear. Students called from the school building. They were having an evening event, wanted Evelyn to come judge a debate competition. She squeezed Caleb's hand once more, then headed down to the building where 15 young people, all of them considered unteachable by traditional schools, were preparing to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. Caleb watched her go, then turned his attention back to the ranch. There was always more work, always something that needed fixing or tending or improving. But it was his work on his land, built through his choices. That night, after the debate ended and the students went home and the ranch settled into quiet, Caleb and Evelyn sat in their bedroom with notepads between them, like always. "I've been thinking," Caleb wrote, "about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. What about it? I used to think legacy was about building something that lasted. The ranch, the school, the changes we made in the territory." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But I don't think that's it anymore." "Then what is it?" "I think it's about showing people what's possible. We weren't supposed to succeed. People like us weren't supposed to build meaningful lives. But we did. And now other people like us know it can be done." His handwriting got messy with emotion. "That's legacy, not the buildings or the business. The possibility we proved existed." Evelyn read it through tears, wrote back, "We weren't trying to prove anything. We were just trying to survive. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the best legacies aren't planned. They're just the result of refusing to accept the life other people said we had to live." They fell asleep eventually, Caleb's arm around her shoulders, the notepad discarded on the floor. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through grass and trees, carrying sounds Caleb couldn't hear and that Evelyn's damaged voice couldn't match. But inside, in the home they'd built together, there was only peace and the quiet satisfaction of two people who'd looked at the world's cruelty and chosen to build something better instead. Years later, when historians wrote about the development of disability education in the American West, they'd mention the Ryder School as a pioneering institution. When ranching journals discussed sustainable cattle management, they'd reference Caleb Ryder's innovations. But the real story wasn't in those records. It was in the children who grew up believing they could succeed despite their differences. In the families who learned to see ability instead of disability. In the small shift in culture that said being different didn't mean being less. It was in the fact that a woman who'd lost her voice and a man who'd never heard one had spoken louder through their actions than most people managed with words. And it was in the simple, stubborn truth that sometimes the people society throws away turn out to be exactly the ones who change it. The Ryder Ranch still operates today, passed through generations. The school Evelyn founded eventually merged with the public education system but kept her methods. The territory became a state, and Dry Hollow became a city. And most people forgot the story of the silent bride and the deaf rancher who refused to disappear. But the foundations they built remained, in every teacher who adapts lessons for students who learn differently, in every person who communicates across barriers instead of accepting them, in every life built on stubbornness and hope, and the refusal to accept other people's limitations as your own reality. That was the legacy. Not perfect, not without cost, but real and enduring, and proof that the world's definitions of who matters are always smaller than the truth of what people can build when they refuse to be defined by someone else's judgment. Evelyn Whitmore Ryder died at 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren and former students who'd traveled across states to say goodbye. Her voice, damaged from childhood illness, barely worked at the end. But she'd long since proven that speaking and being heard were different things. Caleb followed her 2 years later, his ranch thriving under his son's management, his methods still taught in agricultural schools, His story still told as an example of what determination and innovation could accomplish. They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the valley they'd called home, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates and nothing else. No grand epitaphs about overcoming obstacles or inspiring others, just two names, two lives, two people who'd loved each other and built something that mattered. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.